unmute after the first minute and say clarity, then I'll take you. But clarity, not POI. For POI, put it in the text space. If it's a clarity, immediately after the first minute, just unmute and say clarity. Yeah, and I'll take you. Let me set up my timer and then I'll begin. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First argument: why do we think governments are able to pull this off and do it in an efficient manner and be able to nationalize and provide these services to citizens effectively? There are two things here. Number one is in terms of resources, and then the second one is in terms of management. The first, in terms of resources, we say governments, whether developing or developed, get resources and have resources. One, from taxes they collect. Secondly, they get revenue from things such as exports, from things such as profit from government businesses, and from things such as bonds, issuing of bonds. Thirdly, they are likely, especially developing nations, they are likely to get grants, which is money that is given to you, but it's like charity, so you don't have to pay it back. And they are likely to get it from like developed nations, for example, from European countries, from America, and so forth. And the reason they are likely to get this, and they already do in status quo, is that there's a lot of geopolitics, especially in status quo, where countries are competing to see who will like be the King Kong of the world. So America is competing against China and Europe, and they are competing to like get in the good books of like African countries and developing countries, for example. So they have a lot of incentives to give you this grant so that they appear like angels to you and that sort of thing, which is a huge source of income to be able to pull this off. But the last source of income countries can always utilize is the idea of loans. So on the idea of resources, we think we have resources. Secondly is on the idea of management. We think as a government, we are willing to employ technocrats to be able to manage these companies, people who are like, experts in these fields, to be able to manage these companies and ensure they provide the necessary resources to the citizens. We posit probably the counterfactual for opposition's world is probably privatization, because I'm not sure if there's any other counterfactual within status quo that you can use apart from privatization. Anyway, yeah, I'll take that clarity.
It could be a government-private partnership. We just don't think that government should nationalize it. There's a meaning to nationalization.
Yeah, if you say it's a government-private sort of thing, we think that's a soft stance, especially because you are going to posit the private sector is probably going to have more of a say in that kind of partnership more than the government, and I'll explain later in my speech if that's your comparative. But anyway, why do we prefer governments to nationalize this? We say these kind of services are essential for day-to-day living of citizens. They are tantamount to like life and death. So for example, something like access to a hospital, like if you can't access hospital and medicine, literally it means you die. Things such as being able to access schools is good for you, because schools give you the skills for you to be able to achieve economic mobility within status quo and that sort of thing. So why do we then think privatization or government private that counterfactual is bad for citizens within the nation? Number one, because of access. Why do we think access is limited in their world to citizens to able to access these services? A couple of reasons here. Number one, companies are profit oriented. This is because of, one, you have to take care of shareholders. Number two, you have to worry about expanding the company or expanding the company, because they always want to expand and get more profits. Number three is that you have to get back the money you invested, because when you take these entities, like let's say you privatize them, you have to put in money into them and you have to get back that money. So for you to get back that money, it means you have to do things such as put in high prices so that you can be able to do it. So even if it's a government private, this motive incentive still exists, which means you still have to get high prices in your world anyway. What does this mean? It means, number one, for the poor individuals who are the most vulnerable in this situation, because it doesn't change anything for the rich, but for the poor individuals, it means they don't have access to these amenities, because it just means they get too expensive for them to be able to access them. But the second reason why you are likely to get high prices is because there is limited competition within their world. And why is this so? Number one, like, because there are very few companies to choose from. Like, there are very few companies who are rich enough to be able to, for example, take care of hospitals in a state, or for example, be able to take care of electricity generations. So there are few companies to choose from, which means there are also few companies that can be able to compete with each other, which means you are likely to get a monopoly. But more than that, because they need to get back their money, they are likely to go into deals with the government that say you can't allow any other company to come into the market, because if you allow other companies to come into the market, we can't get back the money we invested initially. So you need to give us that monopoly power, otherwise we are not going into this deal, regardless of whether it's full privatization or government in company privatization. Yeah, I'll take up your. Why do we think then, on the case of government, you are likely to have access? Number one, because governments have political incentives. For example, you want to be re-elected in the next general election. But secondly, is that governments are not profit driven; they are more service driven. This is because they don't just have to take care of shareholders and worry about expanding. They have to take care of all their citizens, because by the social contract theory, everyone in that state is their citizens and they need to take care of them, which means you are likely to get things such as subsidizing of prices. You are likely to get things such as cheap prices for citizens, which means largely you have more access to these kind of things. The impact of getting limited access in their world means, number one, the most vulnerable individuals cannot be able to access this. Secondly, you are likely to get things such as rioting in your country because people are dissatisfied, which is bad because it causes instability and it can lead to things such as investors going away. But thirdly, is that just that government is likely to be kicked out in the next election, which means the government lose power, which is bad for them. The last argument here I would like to argue is on the idea of lobbying. We say companies are likely to lobby governments to be able to, number one, have high prices, but number two, reduce things such as protection of employee rights or protection of environment rights. This is because when you allow them access to these kind of companies, they essentially have you by the balls, because if you don't agree to them, they can essentially decide to leave, and then you won't be able to provide these services anymore because you have become reliant on them. My partner will extend, proud to propose.
Okay, thank you to opening government. Can we now have the opening opposition? Hello.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, I'm coming. So, let me set my timer. Alright. Alright, so assuming I'm still audible, I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, understand that what we'll be doing basically in today's debate is to engage with opposition and like characterize the nature of government in running business and like the nature of government in running the country and why these two things usually conflict. Show why these sectors of the economy are absolutely crucial and show why private involvement is important. And panel note, our stance is not that we are going to do a private public partnership and that this like in this debate. What we are saying is that there should be a private involvement. It could be a full-blown privatization of certain parts. It could be a private government like um partnership in certain parts. We just don't think that it should be like a nationalization. Nationalization basically means that it is the government that determines how resources are allocated, what is produced, to what extent what is produced, where what is produced goes, and things like that. We just don't think that the government should have like should like take on this role, right? So first of all, engaging OG, they bring like two broad cases. On one, government efficiency, and on two, like assets. Let me deal with government efficiency. We agree that government has like a vast amount of resources. The problem is with the management case. So they say government will employ technocrats. There are two main problems with this. One is that technocrats are political experts. It means that government incentive to push these political experts into certain strategic areas which require like much more technical skill in business management and things like that is going to be high. The result is that there's going to be most likely a high level of unproductivity, since government has an incentive to use this thing as a political chip to make sure to score political scores. It means that government will try to push their own people into these spaces, and it means that because most of these people are going to be political experts and like not probably business experts or probably aviation experts and things like that, they're going to struggle. Second thing is that these sectors require like full-blown attention from the people who are managing it. The fact that the government can have divided attention between like its people. So, for example, when a government sends someone there, the person is concerned about like the government's image and like making sure that the government looks as best as possible. It means that like focus will be driven away from providing a quality service to making sure that whatever government wants to be done is done. The problem is that governments have a history of loss. Government has a history of mismanagement. I think in my substantive, like this analysis will come clear. I seem to be struggling here, but let's move on. So the second thing on government efficiency and why it is bad is politicization. The incentive to employ unqualified people. The reason why this is high is because it will be used as a campaign message. It will be used as a way to score political points. We think that's highly likely. It means that if you're employing unqualified people into absolutely crucial sectors of the economy, you can imagine what will happen. Lots of unproductivity, lots of poor services, etc. Government will grant more access. There are three structural reasons why this is most likely going to be better when like it is being handled with private involvement much more than government, because one is limited access to resources for private sectors. Panel, we think that the fact that private sectors have limited access to resource means that for them to stay profitable and for them to stay sustainable, they have to expand to like a higher number of markets as much as possible to get a lot of customers as much as possible. Given that these are absolutely crucial sectors of the economy, it's unlikely that these services are going to be so expensive that people cannot afford. It means that private sectors are will much more have the incentive to expand more to do it. The reason why government will most likely not expand more is that government will try to focus on like highly popular sectors of the economy to make sure that, or highly popular sectors of the country to make sure that they score points there, because at the end of the day, that's the part of it that's needed for like winning political party and things like that. It means that the propensity to neglect other parts of the economy or other parts of the country, sorry, is going to be high. For the private guy, every part that you can get money from is very needed for survivability and for sustainability. It means that they're most likely going to expand more. It means that access is most likely more in our world. But then secondly, these services are actually absolutely crucial. It means that like these people will most likely go because
Yeah.
private companies or like other companies are there to respond when I'm coming. Then competition. They are saying in their word that there is limited competition because of private action. In their word, there's no competition because it's government that is nationalizing it. It means that absolute monopoly. It means that if government is providing bad services, there's no one most likely to challenge it because government has monopoly over resources and things like that. It means that in their world, like prices are most likely going to be expensive, given like how I've characterized how governments run and things like that. I'm coming. Let me make my case before taking my 5 minutes. So why is government a bad actor here, and why is government most likely going to be efficient? One, bureaucracy, the delay in taking decisions, the number of offices that letters must go through before basic decisions to make like the company run will be taken. Second thing is loose budgetary constraints. The fact that governments have monopoly over resources means that even if they are running at a loss, governments can bail them out. It means that the incentive or like the propensity to run at a loss is very high. History of loss. Consistently, it's been proven that like state-owned companies are like much less competitive in efficiency, much more than like companies. Corruption, because of the high existence of corruption. But then thirdly, propensity for government to affect other sectors of the economy. Before I analyze that, yes, I'm taking your POI. Probably, preferably from closing. 3, 2, 1. Continuing. All right. So then the nature of government. The thing that government has a lot of priorities. because of that, it will become much more difficult to focus on very niche sectors which need a lot of focus. Why do we say that? Because of things like managing internal and external security, making sure that you are coordinating the intelligence services, the army, the police. All of these things require a lot of government attention. It means that government resources will be spread thin to make sure that all of these government hands reaches all of these things. But then managing things like foreign policy and things like that is very high. But then exposure to political change, how changing political parties will bring changing political philosophy, which affects government economic decisions, is going to be very high. We think that the character of these sectors, which require which are very capital intensive, which require a large scale of operation, which require like the existence of multiple options, means that ultimately governments running these sectors are going to be like highly efficient. Why do you think a private involvement, whether it is privatization or like private partnership, is going to like increase the incentive to produce quality service? We think that the idea that these services are crucial means that there's most likely going to be like multiple sectors multiple players like wanting to run services in that scenario. Because of competition, it means that there's going to be like most likely quality of service, because that's how you make it. If you don't have quality service, do not buy your services. Investment. We think that private sectors have um an incentive to bring external investors in, because it is government running this show, and because if investors are usually skeptical of government, they might not want come in. Efficient use of resources, because of this scarcity, private service sectors will want to use this thing. Sourcing of external investment, I've already dealt with it. So panel, at the end of today's debate, our stance is simple. We don't think that these services government must run them as one entity. We think that private sector should be involved, either full privatization or like government private partnership. Proud.
Thanks to the leader of opposition, can we now have the Deputy Prime Minister?
So I'm going to ask for a point of information in my 5th minute. Don't say clarity in my 2nd or minute 1 minute. I'm going to ask for the POI myself. So with that said and done, in 3, 2, and 1, I begin. We need to understand that the aim of this debate today is to show in which type of like house is the government going to ensure that we get good social amenities, and where in like what bench is the government actually pressured to be the best or the creme de la creme in terms of like making sure that there are good services to the people. The government is bound and legitimized by the social contract theory. It has 3 arms: the legislature, executive, and judiciary. The legislature makes the laws, and so it's going to pass a bill in parliament to nationalize all these sectors which fall under the basic human rights. The executive, which deals with technocrats, is the one which is going to execute and head all these functionalities. The first rebuttal I'm going to give to LO says that technocrats are usually politicians. Panel, this is a lie. Technocrats are usually people who are specialized, say, in economics, education, professors, but they have a political stance. They can say that I support, say, UDA in the Republic of Kenya. So in the worst case scenario on our side, these technocrats might propose the ruling party's implementation. And since they want to seek re-election, they want global acceptance, which still serve the majority. The opposition leaders and even the United States Embassy in like this kind of like interference in like the kind of national politics, or say in developing countries politics, usually serves as a check and balance to ensure that these technocrats are living up to task, because they don't want to be sanctioned. The moment your entity is sanctioned, say as the cabinet secretary of health or as the cabinet secretary of like say finance, if you are sanctioned, it means that your government can't lobby, or your government can't go to the US and ask for loans. That's why these people usually say that they are going to elect, say, the technocrat who probably studied in Harvard or who probably studied in Makerere or Witwatersrand, so that these people can actually have some kind of good lobbying power. We tend to think that OO is actually out, and they say that these people are politicians. In the worst case scenario, even if these people decide that, okay, say we are going to actually implement the ruling party's policies, and then like come next election, this thing is going to be altered. Panel, you need to understand that if the government begins to nationalize today, it means that a bill, time, and energy has been spent. It means that probably for the next 10 or 15 years, this is going to be the trend. If we have elections after every 5 years, that means that the government that then another law will probably have to be passed or gazetted, that we tend to think that a policy or a kind of project will have to go for probably 10 years before it is told, because government also uses common sense. It cannot spend taxes actually putting a project today and unearthing another project tomorrow. We tend to think the more it nationalizes things, the more it now stands to create a good footprint on how to actually mitigate and go about projects which came from the other outgoing party or something like that. You need to understand that services are usually affordable and subsidized. This is true because we've seen the essence of bursaries, grants, and even actually gives grants for developing. And we've also seen governments taking loans so that we can see bursaries. We've also seen sometimes hospitals, people go under the health insurance fund, and like sometimes you're given the parastatal insurance and things like that. So we tend to think that services are probably going to be affordable and subsidized in the worst case scenario. Government needs to have some kind of market intervention, because we live in a capitalistic world, and the trend is that business entities want to prioritize profit at the expense of minding the pockets of people. This trend means that the government needs to take opportunity and invent capitalism, prevent low quality products or people who impose unjustified high prices for products and services. You need to ensure that some industries with higher barriers of entries, most often because of the high initial capital investment that OO is speaking about, are available to the public. OO tells you that, you know what, government is busy. You know what, it is dealing with military, it is dealing with finance, so it cannot look at every other thing. We tend to say that this is the high barrier of entry, that we've allowed multinational companies and even the private sector to take about the labor laws panel, to take about, like, say, the affordable housing projects and entities to such an capacity to, we even lack, like, say, the resources, and time has gone and is not on our side. The moment you nationalize, you put the government in a corner. You have to make them understand what does it mean to run these particular entities on that particular aspect. We say we win because we put the government in a corner to ensure that it understands how the free market operates. You need to understand that this creates more employment opportunities, because what the private sector does is that it usually wants to stimulate the profit and give about a lot of profits to shareholders. Therefore, it always wants to reduce employment and maximize the profit. So this means that it tries to also limit the entries of barriers. So if the government nationalizes, at least we tend to think that this government is probably going to be re-elected. At least people are going to be happy in the worst case scenario because they have employment. Why we tend to think these citizens are going to be happy? Number one, government services come with some kind of stimulus packages, such as salaries panel, such as mortgage and pensions. Things why we people say governments are usually stable. At least you get some kind of, the government is unstable in terms of a COVID pandemic. It is also possible to bail it out compared to the private sector in the worst case scenario. At least there you ensure that you attract foreign direct investment, the way Mwendwa has told you, that it is easier for you to lobby. So it means that foreign direct investmentarianism on our side of the house. Up your eye before I continue. In 3, 2, 1. Okay. Lobbying, that once private companies control these essential services, they have the government by the balls. So because now they control these essential services, if you do not agree with the government, they are going to put you out, which means that essential services are going to be provided for the citizens. At the end of the day, panel, we also tend to say that competition is there because in a capitalistic world, the government does not want to actually be sanctioned. It does not want to be told that, you know what, Makerere University is not going to compete with Harvard because of their poor curriculum and things like that. That is how we say that globalization actually mitigates for competition, because now here you want to actually compete with the cream de la cream, so you want to ensure that your technocrats are the best of the best who provide government with good capacity to compete at the end of the day. Something else, panel, that you need to understand is this private-public partnership, whatever OO is speaking about, is very detrimental, because governments need to live to their obligation. At a point in time that governments have no opt-out, they're actually forced to live up to, like, good expectations of people and avoid backlash and probably international backlash. And that's why we say that governments are better off providing good services at our side of the house. Proud to propose.
Thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister, can we now get the Deputy Leader of Opposition?
Just to confirm, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. Okay,
Yeah,
check DM. Please check your DM.
I have. I have. 1 second, guys. Please unmute. Would preferably take a PY from closing because we've not heard from you throughout the debates, but open to if you guys have something else to say. Yeah, let me just set my timer real quick. Okay. Where's the timer? Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Recognize that OGs out of the debates because of a lot of things that they say. First thing that they say is, oh, they are going to necessarily invite technocrats and all of those people that are going to be able to manage these services. Recognize that a lot of these people have alliances to political parties, political change in power every 4 years, 5 years, depending on what country you're talking about. And one thing that political parties use as a campaigning method are different policies that are used as their main strategy. So one political party will prioritize education, one political party will prioritize health, etc., etc. This translates the kind of policies going to enact when they come into power. This means that as they prioritize in the next year when they win power, what it means when you nationalize these essential resources means that if the political party that's in power does not prioritize education, it means that less resources go to education, less supervision. There's really no education. Recognize that political parties have different policies how they want a particular sector to run. So one political party believes that education should be free. This means that the quality of the service with regards to how people have access to it. So the average citizens that live in the states, because at best the rich people or the people in the higher social classes will be able to afford it regardless, but the people in the lower social classes are the ones that are necessarily going to suffer as a result of this. But the second thing I talk about is how they think that these private people don't necessarily have any form of doubt and they are going to run out the laws. It's things like 19. I think that's worse when it's nationalized. Why? Because a lot of these people that work at these sectors know that when they are supposed to reduce their efficiency or if they don't give all their best in providing the services, the government is going to be able to maximize their efficiency and make sure that the services that they are providing is necessarily going to be best. But the second thing they say is, oh, these private people are going to exploit people because they have lobbying power over the government. Recognize that one thing that they fail to understand is the existence of these private people in the sector does not take away the existence of governments in the states. Governments still exist. They still have an incentive to protect all the citizens because of the social contract theory. So government is still going to ensure that one, labor laws are things that exist. So things such as retirement policies, things such as leaves, paid leaves, etc., are things that governments are going to necessarily pay attention to. But what they do in their world is that if the government is the one that is supposed to be in power, and if the government is the one that's not passing these policies, or the government is taking particular stands that are exploitative, there's really nobody to call them out. But in our world, the government exists and is necessarily going to call out these private people and like prevents them from taking advantage of people like in every sense possible. But then another thing that they say is that, oh, they think that efficiency in the government sector is necessarily going to be bad. The thing of comparing it to the private sector where there's less bureaucracy because at best all they have to do is have a shareholder meeting as compared to the government where they have to probably go for a whole cabinet meeting. They take weeks and months to necessarily decide on what they're going to do. But so it means that there's going to be less bureaucracy in the private sector. But secondly, on how there's probably going to be more supervision because a lot of these private people that work have an incentive to be able to maximize maximize the profits that they get. This means that there's like a more supervision from the people at the higher ups as compared to the government sector, where they know that regardless of what they do, they're going to get their monthly pay at the end of the month. Also, what it also means is that this high level of supervision takes away the level of corruption that exists in the private sector. It means that people have less incentive to be corrupt because they know that there are lots of watchful eyes that are going to be necessarily caught if they take on to corrupt acts, as compared to the government sector, where they know that at best, if there's even going to be a chance of them being caught, is when they are pursuing, like they are stealing large amounts of money before. But then why do we win the debate from OO then? If I continue your POI shoots, probably from closing.
It's going to be weak for you to talk about partnership, because when you talk about partnership, the benefits of nationalizing still exist on your word. I think there's a need for you to defend privatizing fully and why those sectors don't deserve nationalization.
We think that nationalization is something that can exist with particular sectors such as like electricity, because the government should be able to control those things. What we are against is nationalizing all sectors, and that's like literally the wording of the motion. So privatization in full force and government's private partnership is something that we are defending in our world. And then why do we win the debate? We think in principle it's principally unjustified for the government to necessarily take away the work or the livelihood of these private sectors. Recognize that in status quo, a lot of these private people already have their businesses and companies, and what it means is that they have people that they have employed. They necessarily pay taxes and revenue. They bring about foreign investments into the country, and this like it directly contributes to maximizing the economies of these particular states. At the point where nationalization happens, where you're nationalizing all these sectors, it means that all these private people, that all these private companies are going to lose out on all the benefits that they get. So people are going to be unemployed because the company is being dissolved. There's really no work for them to be able to get it. But secondly, the kind of influx of taxes and revenue that we get from these private people is going to be necessarily lost. I think as a government, you should be at a strategic position where you'll be able to maximize the kind of benefits that you get out of the multiple like things that exist in your economy. At the point where you're cutting out on particular things, if you're cutting out on things such as the revenue and taxes that you get from these private companies, what it means is that your revenue and your money that you're supposed to you are going to be able to use to pass policies and give people the basic social amenities is going to be reduced on a higher level. We think for the average citizens that's going to be able to get out of these social amenities. We don't think that we should utilize that. We should put them in a position where if the government is mediocre, they have to be stuck with the mediocre services and things that they're supposed to get. I think that the principle of how they should have multiple options, where if you don't like this one, you can necessarily have access to this one, is something that we support them. What then is the way up in the debate? I think that because of the kind of burden that the government has, kind of how all the sectors have different demands, and how the government is going to have a lot on their plate. I think it's fair for the government to allow other people to also take up some of the burden. But secondly, I think the government is in higher position to be able to check these things and essentially make sure that the private people are not exploiting people, but the private people are not even becoming like monopolies as these people say. But one thing that the last thing that OG says is that, oh, these private people are going to lobby with the government and prevent other people from competing. Recognize that the government wants to be able to utilize the best out of these people. And I'm sorry, what?
Time. It's 7 minutes 30 seconds.
Wow. Oh.
Okay. Thank you to the DLO. Can we now get the member of government? Member of government, when you're ready. Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to start my if you have a POI, please, I think you can unmute in my 15 minutes and say POI, but try not to badge on my speech, please. I think you can just ask once and then mute yourself back, and I'll take you if I can. Yeah. Otherwise, I think my partner will just take you. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, I think that the biggest threat to things like states' capacity to fulfill their social contract COB and also its obligation to a vast majority of people who live within society is the existence of private sectors who either perform better than states in certain sectors, would harm and also a principal state threat to things like, say, state legitimacy and also by extension its sovereignty. Given that what you do is that states shouldn't given that what exists is that states should be able to cater to the basic necessities of individuals, right? Because it's necessary to preserve that legitimacy while fulfilling its part of the social contract theory. What we're going to do is to prove two things within today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to be proving the justification for why we should nationalize this. But secondly, we're going to prove why, in principle, states have an obligation to nationalize these particular sectors because it's a representation for the sole reason for statehood. But lastly, we're also going to prove why not nationalizing this is a threat and a risk that threatens the legitimacy of states and also puts citizens at risk. But let's go into the justification for why this nationalization should take place, because I think opening government does this, but they don't do this to a good extent. The reason why this should happen, the justification, is because it directly affects the human dignity of individuals in getting access. Because the normalization of society or the norms that exist within society is that it gives credence or relevance to certain individuals based on how individuals are able to cater for basic needs. It means then that things like people being judged or people being recognized for things like opulence or things like having access, it means that whatnot, this is a direct assault in principle because you use people as a means to an end and you don't give them access to basic needs. But two, mechanism for giving people certain level of controls to individuals. Why is that level of control something that is important? Because in the vast majority of instances, you have things like monopoly of power. You have capitalism of people's life and making things unaccessible, unaccessible to individuals, which is a direct assault to that particular limitations of individuals' rights. So it means in most instances you have things like banning things like privacy and what have you. We think that what this does is to at least uphold that level of legitimacy to certain individuals in terms of preservation of individuals' human dignity, and that is a justification. But let's go into the first piece of extension as to why we beat opening governments and any other thing within today's debate. Firstly, state obligation in principle and the reason for statehood. We think that the basic human rights are the reason why statehood exists in the first place. Because if you understand the way society works, prior to the creation of states, people lived freely and acted out of their own personal will, right? In most instances, that was the reason why you had a chaotic society, people uprooting governmental structures and what have you, doing whatever they like. What it created was, what it then meant was that there was a pool preferences. So in the absence, however, the role of states is to ensure that in buying food for yourself, you don't directly do things like harm another individual or create self-harm to yourself. In most instances, the role of states is to equip individuals with the skills and also the systems that protect those particular basic human rights that only them can grant you. Because those human rights are the prerequisite to other benefits that you might desire in terms of getting a well-fulfilled or living a well-fulfilled life. Why is this something that is true? One, your right to education is a requirement to having things like access to inclusion in social cycles. So in most instances, it depicts how you're able to interact with the vast majority of society and also getting social benefits. You can't access things like good jobs without having access to education. You can't fight for things like your right within the constitution of it to access to medical healthcare system is a requirement to the function of yourself and also the vast majority of society by extension. Because you can't, if you are not well enough, you can't be healthy or you can't do things like be productive to yourself and also to society. You being healthy is a prerequisite to you performing well in society and also performing yourself. But two things only able to access other desires in your life. But if you have unlimited access to the basic needs, it means that governments should do this, right? Currently.
Again, regulated and private exploitation. Google, Apple, Meta, all of them have answered to Congress. Closing governments have proven why our case is winning, basically, because we show you why private assets is able to provide all of this thing better.
Yeah, my partner will take care of that. Let's go to second piece of extension and arguments that we have. Why not nationalizing this puts citizens at risk? I think one, that the absence of nationalization means that you allow citizens to limit access by creating, say, premiums on these particular sectors, which limits people from accessing them equally. So in most instances, you limit the vast majority of people, but even those who have access are the 1% people who are on top of the social ladder. The comparison is that monopoly, like the comparison is a monopoly of state on our side. So even if state isn't effective like they want to claim, state has a mandate to ensure that these particular rights are accessible, like what opening opposition wants to buy you within today's debate, right? Which is funny, really. State mandates that this particular right is accessible because they are the only one who can be able to hold capitalist structures accountable for shortage of that, but because of how these private sectors market themselves, they are seen as the ones that provide these services better, right? So the problem here is that it demeans the work that government does and make people see states as incompetent. The reason why that is problematic is because you then begin to have things like opt-out in states, right? People feel that they can be better. People feel that state isn't right. That's why you have, but secondly, worst case scenario is that you have things like opt out of states. It's the reason why you have things like, say, states losing legitimacy or by like worst case scenario, losing sovereignty. So you have in most instances the interference of government policies by other countries and limiting government power. We think that inherently is something that is problematic, and that's the reason why we win this debate. Proudly, CG.
Thank you to closing government. Again, I want to remind you guys to be mindful of opposition to start off their case.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, cool. Let me time myself quickly. Okay, I'll start my speech in the next word. Cool. Chairperson, for a civil society, the most important thing in every system that is civil enough is diversity, right? That is that we need diversity socially, economically, and culturally. These are the things that are very essential for civil society. And this is to say, anything that threatens that particular socialization and that particular diversity, it goes in contrast to what is necessary for civil society to actually succeed, even in governmental systems. And the problem, this is like the specific problem that has to come with nationalization, because what it proposes is essentially monopoly in terms of like government, right? This is what we believe closing government. We tell you that nationalization of sectors essential to basic can do a few things. One, it can lead to inefficiencies. Secondly, undermine individual freedoms and also create unintended consequences that will ultimately, one, jeopardize the very rights that governments aims to actually to protect. And this is something that we cannot advocate for, right? So what are the generalized problems with nationalization, and more specifically when it comes to things that are basic human rights, right? One, currently in history or even in status quo, we do not have any evidence that actually show us that governmental institutions have proven themselves to actually be efficient, right? We don't necessarily see why we take things that are so crucial and fundamental themselves time and time to be inefficient, right? We do not necessarily get that particular justification from government as to why, regardless of all the negative things that we have seen with governmental institutions throughout the world, we would take things such as that are so vital to human lives and give them to the very institutions that have proven themselves to be inefficient, right? Secondly, is the problem we've already told you is that is the issue with monopoly, right? We understand that the moment you take these sectors and you fully give them to government, there is a sense of monopoly. With monopoly now, we no longer have incentives to actually be innovative as human beings, right? So now essentially what you have within private sectors, or rather within sectors such as health and education, you have stifled the innovation. There is no innovation. We do not progress as human beings, right? The moment that monopoly exists within that particular thing, the moment we lack innovation, then that is being provided to us to struggle to maintain certain standards in terms of health, education, in terms of energy and transportations. These are things that we do not necessarily believe that government institutions on their own are necessarily capable of actually giving them to the people, right? But on the fourth level, it's the issue of without any justification, they want to limit the choices that are given to people. We believe in liberal democratic societies, people should have a wide variety of choices, right? The moment you now tell you that say, hey, this thing does not change anything for the rich, which I tell you that is it is highly false, right? Because now you are subjecting people to that thing is very poor in terms of quality, actually delivering proper services, right? We do not believe government can actually live to the standards that we currently seemingly enjoy in status quo, where people have choices, where people are able to exercise the freedom that they're given by democracy. Understand governmental institutions are driven by political incentives, right? To say, one, if the polls are saying you need to cater for more black people, then white people are most likely going to suffer. And if now all of a sudden the polls are saying that you should cater for Asians and for whites, then that means that anyone who does not fall within that particular majority is now going to fail. And now you have limited those people because now you have monopolized everything that is essential to them, and you're only driven by the next elections that are necessarily coming, and now you have taken essential resources from those problems, right? But what is generally even more problematic about nationalization, especially when in status quo we consider the characteristics of what governmental is, the issue of corruption. Governmental systems have over the years proven themselves to be very corrupt, right? We do not necessarily understand why nationalization will all of a sudden get rid of those corruption elements. Then secondly, in terms of incentives and monopoly, we don't understand how all of those things are effectively, and how they put government in a position where they can actually be able to cater for people. Right? Also, in terms of limited accountability, right? We realize that in terms of holding governmental institutions to hold them accountable, we really ever hold them accountable to the fullest extent that we can actually be able to do all of those things. Right? Because government have over the years proven themselves to be inefficient in terms of allocation of resources, right? Now you also want the same government to do what? To restrict the individual freedoms without like the most vulnerable any other options. The government that have proven themselves to be corrupt and have a lot of cronyism that exists within there. Okay? These are things that we see in status quo, right? We have case studies that exist in status quo. For example, Venezuela like it nationalized its oil industries, right? In terms of health, we see that Cuba did changes in terms of healthcare and all of those, right? Another example is like South Africa in its attempts to actually nationalize its but now they have to deal with like frequent power outages and things like load shedding, right? These are just examples in status quo. Would we necessarily see that these people or these states have actually successfully failed in terms of nationalization and how they essentially fail the very vulnerable society and essentially fail everyone with a particular society, right? But you must understand this, right? Everything you hear from government is very much theoretical and will not succeed, right? While nationalization creates more problems than it actually solves, right? Alternative solutions exist, such as better regulations, public that could be more targeted and balance between social welfare and the economic efficiency of individual freedoms. These are things that we must be able to have. Diversity is very crucial for us to have like economic growth, innovation, and competitiveness as like it drives and fosters problem-solving spirit, right? The only way for us to be able to put governmental institutions at a point where like they are able to like better take care of their citizens is when like they have incentives and they have well-vested revenues and they're economically prosperous. Oh, thank you.
Thank you to member of opposition. We now have the government whip.
Yeah, hello everyone. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Great. I'm going to be taking POIs in the text alone. I am looking at text space 2. Text space 2. Okay, I think someone was. All right. I'm looking at text space 2. If you have a POI, please shoot. Do not unmute your mic for any reason whatsoever. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The global financial crisis of 2008, which triggered a worldwide recession, made many people lose their jobs across every part of the world, was a product of private property failure. The Lehman Brothers, who at the time had a monopoly of the banking institution in the United States of America. At that time, the US allowed them act in a certain way without properly regulating. This means that regulation is even problematic on private institutions, given that states in most instances make benefits off them and have no incentive to properly regulate them. Social crisis impacted on the world till today is still felt. What this intro proves is that private institutions also have the capacity to fail. They are not as perfect as upbenches would want to claim, and closing opposition more ridiculously establishes. I think there's a need to make a concession that state either has the capacity to be inadequate. I think there's a concession, the capacity to be fully accountable. The reason as to why this is visible in the vast majority of instances is because you have many private institutions, you have many private schools, you have many private hospitals. We've seen many instances where hospitals go bankrupt, where these schools do not have the capacity, financial capacity to sustain themselves anymore. It means then that they collapse. People have to think the movements to make a concession here, because in their own words, there is a need to make a concession that preventive outframing takes opening up and closing opposition out exclusively. I think it's important to note closing opposition has one extension. The extension is diversity. That diversity is important. If you check your notes well, you're going to see the similarity in ideas with opening opposition's claim, because it's still the same idea. Opening opposition says we are happy to allow for partnerships. I think partnership is an extension of diversity. So you say, let's diversify. It means that, okay, we're doing things like partnership. I just want to recognize that there's no extent in positions. I'll get to them before that. The first thing I'm going to do in this whip is to weigh us against opening government. I think we beat opening government for two main reasons. The first is the principal mechanization. Panel, I beg you to look at this motion and note that this is not a policy motion. Which means in the vast majority of instances, it's unlikely for us to effectively mechanize things like opening opposition and closing opposition wants to call us out. This is a belief motion, which means we need to prove exclusively that nationalizing all you without limitations. Secondly, she tells you why not nationalizing is bad, because you risk states being illegitimate and people not responding to state anyways. How does this weigh up in the arguments you get on opposition? First, opening opposition. Opening opposition says there is a need for private partnership because these sectors need full-blown attention. Again, attention is not maximized on their work because private institutions do not fulfill those full attention span like they create. The only relevant argument is the competition clash. And just before I engage it, opening opposition, you have a chance to redeem yourself. Shoot a PR.
Panel, the recognition of your moral responsibility does not mean that you have the capacity to perform it. At least in our world, we give governments the responsibility to regulate it by people who are able to do it. After a government collapse in a nationalism, there's no option. These private options like government can
stop now. The representation or the recognition of rights can only be preserved by the people who can only grant them to you. That is state. What we say in principle is that given that states are the only ones that can grant this to you because of the existing social contract theory, it is important that they do that anyways. So let's talk about the competition clash on opening opposition. I don't think competition in itself is so relevant if at the end of the day, states can be responsible to the people. Because the only reason, right, the only reason why people say that private institutions are doing better is because at the end of the day, even if government is competent, private sectors have the capacity to market themselves because they provide these services better. We agree with them. The problem here is that they demean the work that state does. There is a need for states protects its legitimacy in and of itself. Closing opposition says the problems of monopoly is corruption. Again, private institutions can also be corrupt. They can also be inefficient. They also lack accountability. At the best case scenario where we agree that there is a potential for both sides to flop, we think accountability is more on our side because the only people that can grant this right is states. If they fail to do that, you have a principled mandate to hold them accountable because they have failed on fulfilling the social contract theory. Even if you don't provide them inadequately or provide them effectively to people, what you get on closing government work is a principled preservation of the sanctity of those rights. Never been this proud to propose.
Thank you, Government Whip. Can we now have the opposition whip? Yes.
Cool. Just give me a second to turn myself. Okay. Just give me a second and I'll start in all right. In sorry, I'm just putting my notes together. Just give me a second. Okay. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, and 1. A few things to expect from my speech. Number one, a few things that I'm going to do. Number one, what are our contributions to this debate that we provide as closing, and what are our impact for everything else that you've heard in this debate? And we'll also be weighing why we rank over everyone, including our opening, right? So therefore, what is our contribution to this debate? As closing, we extend the argument showed by like operating government, like the argument of like government's monopolies is in essential sectors. It often like those sectors often suffer from the which is like directly the ones that are relying on those services, right? An example of this is like when you consider like a healthcare like sector with like fully nationalized healthcare, as my partner told you about the country of Cuba, such as the UK as well. We think that this is like composed of like long waiting lists and funding like that can be like limited as well, right? So therefore you have limit of accessibility on that side, right? So therefore our side prefers the status quo where both public and like private sector operates in a tandem, right? Where you can like have regulations to prevent discrimination and exclusion, right? This ensures that citizens more choices and better quality services, right? We think the impact of that is the fact that in the healthcare sector, patients benefit from the choice of having public the fact that we find our size approach as closing government that it empowers individuals by allowing one provider, right? This aligns with this aligns as like closing opposite of this like government's case, right? We think that in sector like in the sector like healthcare and education, private entities often drive advancement, right? That is to say that such as like in medical technology and education tools, right? So therefore, when government takes full control, they may lack flexibility and incentive to research and develop. This then limits the quality like of services, right? That is to say that, say for example, even like on education, which schools are leading the private schools, right? Because they're better technology, because they're more flexible and incentivizing research and development better than that of like the government side, right? We think that us as closing, we argue that the private and public sector working together as like a unit and like in a tandem are more likely to maintain high standards and foster the innovation. We regret the argument that this is just and like unsophisticated. The budget to cover all these areas, right, which can lead to underfunding or like neglect some sectors or some places, as we see in status quo, right, especially during economic downturns where resources might be redirected to urgent priorities, right. A private sector focuses in investment in specific services, and it can also allow like more specialized and consistent funding, right, reducing the burden on government's budget and allowing it to prioritize other areas. In our world as closing opposition, you have access to both of those worlds, right? So therefore, this deals with the fundamental premise on all of government side of access, because access is better. Preserve human dignity. We think that people's dignity is preserved when they have freedom to make choices that like suit their individual needs and preferences, right? And one size fits all fails to account to a personal circumstances and limits individuals' autonomy, forcing them to accept a single option that may not be the best for them, right? This lacks the choice to feel like this lack of choice feels like dehumanizing, like disrespectful, as it restricts the people's agency as a whole, right? Another thing that we hear is the state obligation. The state is not obligated to control people, but to allow people to have the freedom of choice and autonomy. We don't want a dictatorship in any state, because you're mostly going to have concentration of power, suppression. Here, our side, right? With that said, partner, we're completely taking this debate. Thank you.
Okay, thank you everyone for that debate. Since it's out round,